if you saw yesterday's LA Times, and you should have, you didn't, the column 1 about those boys who left the polygamous sect in Utah, actually I guess in Arizona, they were taken in by these foster parents in Utah. He wrote that one. And in fact, I'm going to be discussing that a little bit because another editor, a very fine editor at the paper by the name of Millie Kwan, made a suggestion about that piece that was really, really important and fixed a structural problem that John and I missed. And I'll be talking about that in just a little bit. By the way, this whole notion of putting it together, those of you who are Stephen Sondheim freaks may recognize that as a title of one of his songs. Although, thinking about the issues of structure and organizing, another Sondheim song that comes to mind might be Losing My Mind from the Company, or Follies, or maybe Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, because there is blood. There will be blood. So, I want to share with you something that I saw in the New Yorker just a few months ago, okay? It was just the top. This essay by the great writer John McPhee, great writer of nonfiction. He's written The Control of Nature and not Into the Wild, something with the Wild. Anyway, you've read his stuff. He's great. So this is what he said, and this is an essay in the New Yorker, and the title of it is Structure. This is what he says. Out in the back door, under the big ash, was a picnic table. At the end of the summer of 1966, I lay down on it for nearly 2 weeks, staring up into the branches and leaves, fighting fear and panic, because I'd had no idea where or how to begin writing a piece for the New Yorker. I went inside for lunch, surely, and at night, of course, but otherwise remained flat on my back on the table. The subject was the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey. I had spent about 8 months driving down from Princeton day after day, or talking or taking a sleeping bag and a small tent. I had done all the research I was going to do, had interviewed woodlanders, fire watchers, forest rangers, botanists, cranberry growers, blueberry pickers, keepers of a general store. I had read all the books I was going to read, and scientific papers, and a doctoral dissertation. I had assembled enough material to fill a silo, and had no idea what to do with it. The piece would ultimately consist of some 5,000 sentences, but for those 2 weeks, I couldn't write even one. I think we've all been there, haven't we? We've all, more or less, have been on that picnic table staring up on, what do I do? What do I do? And I'll tell you one thing about this essay by McPhee. I found it very comforting. Very comforting that the great, talented John McPhee has issues with structure. I also found it incredibly discouraging. Discouraging that the great and talented John McPhee has issues with structure. It shows, if he's having issues with this, we're doomed. We are just doomed. But there is help. There is help on the way. There are principles of organization, of structure, and we don't really pay attention to these as writers. That's because we want to do the fun stuff. We want to write cool descriptions, we want to have snappy leads, we want to have great snappy endings to stories, we want to write compelling anecdotes. And let's face it, when you hear someone compliment a story, they tend to say, hey, great lead, loved your lead, great ending, love that description. You never hear anyone say, hey, love your structure. You just don't hear that very often. So what I want to do is, the goal of the night is to give you some basic principles of sound structure. And I think this applies for any kind of storytelling. Could be magazines, could be newspapers, could be for fiction possibly. The basic principles are the same. And I'm going to also give you some tools to help you figure out if your structure is a bit screwy. That's the technical writing term, screwy. And I'm even going to have you a little list of danger signs, danger, Will Robinson, danger signs that your structure might be all messed up. Okay, now I have to give also 2 disclaimers here. The first disclaimer is that, oddly enough, you could ignore all the suggestions I'm going to give you tonight. And there's a money-back guarantee with all of them, by the way. They all work. But you could ignore all of them and still produce a story that's well structured and organized. That's how screwy structure is and how loosey-goosey it can be. The other disclaimer is for those, particularly who saw me last year when I spoke to AAJA, you might just hear me reprise 1 or 2 things I said that night. Now, I don't want rolling eyes here. I don't want people going, oh, he said that already. Doesn't he have anything fresh? Is he going to really repeat this? Yes, I am. Okay. But a little refresher is good now and then. Okay. And in fact, if you want me to bring up something that I mentioned last year, I do take requests. If you really want Streets of Laredo, I'll do that again, for those who know what that's about. Okay, but before I give you these keys to the kingdom, to good structure, just a little bit of philosophy here. It's really important. And people who know me know I like to phrase it kind of in a Jeopardy fashion, in a question here. What is the most important thing in writing? What is the most important thing in writing? You know, is it syntax? Is it the structure? Is it the grammar? Is it the words themselves? Answer, none of the above. Now, those are all important things. I'm all for structure. I'm all for good grammar. You know. But none of those things is the most important thing in writing. The most important thing in writing, and we always forget this, is the idea, the meaning, the message. New Yorkers might say, the point that you're trying to make. You know, we get so hung up in how to say something, because that's the fun part. You know, because I'm going to be a writer, you know. We focus so much on the how. Wrong. What we should be doing is obsessing and focusing on the what. What is the idea? What is the point? What is it you're trying to say? Because if you do nail down the what, you will figure out the how. Guaranteed, folks. Because I've run into writers, I've run into students who, when I speak to them, use the English language very well. I can understand them, they talk, we have conversations, everything's fine, you know. And yet when they start to write, everything goes to hell. Why is this? And the reason is not because they don't use the language well. The reason is they don't know what they want to say. It's as simple as that, and as difficult as that. Okay, so keep that in mind, because that's the foundation of everything that follows. And and this all relates to the concept of focus. Because if your ideas are focused, it will help you have focused structure in your stories. Okay? Again, money back guarantee. All right, so let's talk about 5 different ways you can structure a story. 5 different elements that can be useful. The first one is the element of time. Okay? Often chronology, but not exclusively. Time is a great way to organize a story. You know, that's what, you know, it's Huck going down the Mississippi. He starts here and he goes down, you know. It's just passage through time. I find that sometimes I use this maybe as a crutch. When I read a story that's really confused and just all over the place, one of the things I'll do is I'll start circling the dates. Just seeing, is there any way I can justify putting this in chronological order? Because if I can, it will solve so many problems. Another concept of time is how time can frame a story, okay? You have stories that can unfold over a month, that unfold over a week, 7 months. But you also can have stories using the concept of time that can unfold over 20 minutes. In fact, I'm going to share one with you in a little bit. In fact, a narrative that took place in about 20 minutes. Okay. Second way to organize a story, place. Use a venue as your home plate, okay, so to speak. If we want to get into musical terms, maybe your home key. If you're doing a story about the recovery efforts after Hurricane Sandy, or as it became known, Superstorm Sandy. I like that, you know, the yes on the chest, it'd be kind of fun. And Superstorm Sandy, you could focus on one state, but maybe even better, one borough of New York, or maybe better, focus just on Staten Island, which actually is a borough of New York, or maybe better yet, one neighborhood in New York, or better yet, one street on Staten Island. You know, location can be a way to focus your ideas. So think about that, location. Character is the third way, my favorite way. Basically, find your Hamlet. Find your lead character who can just tell the story for you, okay? Not that they're always in every scene. You know, Hamlet leaves now and then. You know, Polonius comes on, does his thing. Claudius, Ophelia, all those folks, they do their stuff. But on the side of the theater, it says Hamlet, and we know what it's about. If you can find one person to hang the story on, that can also be a very good structural device. And I'll give you an example. Oh, in fact, by the way, McPhee solved his problem, the one that he mentioned in that essay, the one where he's on the picnic table, you know, staring at the trees. He solved that through a person. What he realized was, as he was looking through his notes, and he looked at various themes he wanted to touch upon, and various issues, and various locations, he realized that there was this one guy who tended to show up in all those places. So now he had connective tissue, and he could use that one man for this scene, for this thing, for this scene, and that one man related to this idea, this idea, this idea. The guy wasn't in every single scene, but he was there enough to be like kind of like Hansel and Gretel breadcrumbs, kind of leading you along. So character is one way, when you're struggling, how do I organize this thing? Is there a lead person you can use as your vertebra? Point of view. This is one I don't think about enough, I have to confess. I should be better about this. Point of view is basically who's telling the story. Through whose eyes are you seeing the story? That can be a very effective way to bring structural integrity to a piece. And I'm going to give you an example. I'll explain that a little better in a bit. But the use of point of view really can structure things nicely. And using the wrong point of view will send people off down dark alleys where bad things happen. Okay. Then, the fifth way, okay, so we have time, place, character, point of view, and then we have theme or idea. That you have a story structured around entirely just an idea. That is probably the worst way to structure a story, by the way, because it's so loosey-goosey. That's my new word. I've been using this a lot lately, loosey-goosey. If you see it in the LA Times, probably I edited the story. I think. So anyway, please prevent me from putting loosey-goosey in the paper. And Henry, is it hyphenated? Anyway, okay, just good. But theme generally is a very hard way to structure a story, and yet a lot of us try to do it. However, it is possible to do it effectively. There was one I really liked this last summer after the massacre at the, I didn't like the massacre, but I like the story, at the movie theater in Aurora, which my desk covered. And we had a column 1, which is our showcase feature on A1, about what we internally called the signs of grief. People were leaving signs and letters and messages at the memorial that popped up outside the theater. Now, that's not necessarily new, because let's face it, when there's a shooting, a tragedy, or something like that, those memorials pop up, right? Candles, teddy bears, things like that. But the reporters noticed that there were lots of people writing things, and then as people saw signs, they got inspired and they pulled out pens and they're writing on the signs and on the sides and on the backs. And so there was no action in this story. It was literally about the signs of grief. And yet it was a terrific read by Alexandra Zavis about the signs of grief. And we used that as that one linking idea. And what elevated it, by the way, was the notion that in this era of tweets and blog posts and just instant communication, people felt compelled to take out a pen and a piece of paper. And why? And so she asked people that question and got very profound answers, actually. So, ideas. That's another way you can structure a story, although it tends to be a bit loose. All right, now, let's talk about point of view. And this relates to what I call framing devices. That I think one thing that helps a reader get through a story is to understand what is the gimmick, to use the technical writing term, the gimmick. And this really came home to me years ago when I edited a story about the Victor Clothing Company. Anyone know it? The building downtown? It's across the street from the Bradbury Building on Broadway and 3rd. No one does. Okay, great. This will be a challenge. Okay. It's a building in downtown LA, and it has these great murals on it. It's got the one of Anthony Quinn. Have you seen the one? He's doing like this. He's doing his Zorba thing. By the way, if you ever see that mural, take a look at his feet, because he's dancing on these tiles. And if you look across the street into the Bradbury Building, the same tile pattern appears. I don't think that means anything, but I think it's really cool. All right, now, but the important thing is, so we did this story about these two men who were co-owners of the Victor Clothing Company, which was going out of business. And they had to sell the building, but they didn't want it destroyed because of the murals. They were both art lovers. And they had commissioned these beautiful murals outside and inside the building. And they did not want the building torn down. They wanted it turned into lofts. In fact, that's what's happening to it now. Right now, I think they're even renting out apartments and things like that, which is great. They saved the building. So anyway, so we did the story, and it mentions these two guys. One is Ramiro, who was a salesman there, and then his buddy Paul, Ramiro and Paul. So we do this story about these two guys. Paul's the owner, and then he took in Ramiro as like a co-owner. So I turned in the story to the column 1 editor at the paper, and he had a very interesting question. He said, well, who's more important, Paul or Ramiro? And I thought, well, neither. And he said, oh, it's a buddy movie. This was a big event for me. He said, oh, it's a buddy movie. See, here's the thing. The way the story was structured, it looked like it was going to be a story about Ramiro, okay? But then Paul kept running onto the stage and doing things, getting in the way of Ramiro. So it looked like the story was, you know, like a tennis match, going back and forth. It looked unfocused. And that's why he asked, well, who's more important? And when I said, well, they're both, and he said, it's a buddy movie, I realized, aha, we have a two-character movie here, a two-character play, and we didn't tell the reader that's the issue. Does this make sense? In other words, they thought it was an unfocused story. It was focused. It's just we didn't tell them it was about two people. And so all we had to do was play around with the top. And here's some of what we wrote. This was by Jose Cardenas, by the way, who's no longer at the paper, but wonderful guy. The Victor Clothing Company had not made a profit in years. But Ramiro Salcedo couldn't shut the business down. He had to find someone to save the murals. The huge paintings dominate the exterior of Victor Clothing on Broadway near 3rd. They're recognized as symbols of downtown Los Angeles in art circles locally and worldwide. The somber bride and groom, the glowing Olympic athletes, the speeding horse, and most notably, the Pope of Broadway, a dancing tribute to East Side actor Anthony Quinn. The murals were born of a deep, here we go, the murals were born of a deep friendship between Salcedo and one of the men who hired him, Paul Hartner. When they met in 1956, Salcedo was a shy 17-year-old, freshly immigrated from Mexico and looking for work. Hartner, then 40, was more outgoing, an avid traveler and a dancer, the son-in-law of the company's founder. In time, Hartner would make his young protege co-owner of the building. The men were clothes sellers by trade, but as they would discover, art lovers at heart. So now we've told you that this is a buddy movie. This is about these two guys and their mutual love for art, and they're going to save this building. By the way, we did not give away at the top that the building was indeed saved. See, that's one thing journalists have to get used to, is we're always taught to give away the ending, right? Inverted pyramid and all that kind of stuff. And that has its place, but sometimes withhold, hide those facts, you know. In fact, with John Gliona, as great a writer as he is, John wants to get to the point real fast, and rather than move stuff up in his stories, I take things and put them down. Okay, it's a very weird relationship, but we make it work. You know? So anyway, framing is really important. And here's another example involving John Gliona, and this relates to point of view that I was mentioning. So this week we had the story about the Lost Boys, these guys who fled this fundamentalist sect of the Mormon Church, and they've been taken in by these families. So the story was a profile of this young man named Zach, and what the opening scene showed Zach in an argument with essentially his foster mom. Okay, I'm going to share with you just a little bit of it here. Whoops. Zach Bauer's cultural education included a battle of wills over a single, simple task: how to mop the kitchen floor. Just when the teenager thought he was done with the weekly chore, Debbie Hoff-Hines would loom like a drill sergeant, demanding to know whether he'd used enough cleaner. In response, Zach grumbled, slammed doors, and disappeared with friends. Quote, "At first she was so aggressive, she scared me," he said. She'd say, "I want this done now." I'd never seen anything like it. I was like, whoa. Well, he's 19, okay? You can say, like, it was like, whoa, you know. So, in the original version, though, what we did was we had the same lead, but in the second graph, we immediately went to Debbie. And we had a quote from her where she said, quote, "I'd tell him, this doesn't look mopped. Tell me how you mopped it. You didn't use enough cleaner." In other words, what we did was, even though we're telling a story about Zach, we put the spotlight on Debbie. And we totally confused it. In fact, Millie, the editor who read it behind me, said, kind of like with the Victor Clothing Company story, well, is this about Zach or about Debbie? It's about Zach. Doesn't that sound like a theme song or something like that? Or maybe a TV show. It's about Zach. Now on Wednesday nights. So the simple solution was to keep the focus, or keep the point of view from Zach. It's the same information describing this argument they had and the whole issue of mopping the floor. And since we had the option of conveying this information through Debbie's eyes or through Zach's, we use Zach. Okay? And this is a simple thing to do, but I forget it, and I need to remember it more often. Keep in mind that if you can string people through stories, they will, like I said, be that vertebra. They will lead you along. And sometimes it's just as simple as adding their name to something, if it's factually appropriate, of course. And I had a simple story a few years ago about this farm contractor in Georgia, and he was desperate to get these workers to pick blackberries. And we had this opening scene about him getting workers and trucking them to the farms. And then we had to have the obligatory graph that broadened the issue to other things. And we had to talk about that the Department of Agriculture in Georgia was worried that there would be enough pickers statewide. But what we did by doing that was we left Pedro, the farm contractor, and we suddenly went to the state, and it was very jarring. So another editors had a simple solution. They said, well, if these farmers are worried about getting enough workers, surely Pedro is worried too. Well, yeah, he is. So the simple solution was this. That we said, actually we called him in the story Don Pedro, because everyone referred to him like that. We simply, rather than say farmers across Georgia are worried, we wrote Don Pedro, like farmers across Georgia, is worried about getting enough workers. So see, it's very simple little stuff here, but we forget to do this, and that provides linkage. Okay, so that's something to be careful about when you're rereading. More on framing. Let's talk about narratives. It's interesting, people will tell me, Steve, I really want to write a narrative. I want to write a narrative. Okay. Well, a narrative isn't just chronological order. Okay. I think one big key decision you need to make if you're going to write a narrative is this. Are you going to give away the ending? Or rather, when are you giving away the ending? Okay, because that will influence a lot of decisions you make. The same writer who wrote about Don Pedro did another story about a guy named Pedro. In fact, we were hoping that we could do an entire series about only guys named Pedro. We thought that would be just way cool, Couldn't you imagine the Pulitzer Committee? And now for the Pedro series. Oh, I love it. Okay, so anyway, so this other Pedro story was about a young man who had married, he was in the country illegally, and he married this American woman, and he was now in a detention center in Lumpkin, Georgia, which is just as beautiful as you might imagine from the center. Yeah, anyway, so we should have paid the reporter extra for going there and all that. So the story was about Pedro, the fact that Pedro faced a deportation hearing. Okay, and the simple question of the story was, will he stay or will he be deported? Will he stay or will he go? What will happen? And we did not tell you at the beginning. We posed the question and we had that tension, and that's why you kept reading to find out, well, what's going to happen? Okay, by the way, in the end he stayed. People were crying into their breakfast cereal when they read that story, trust me. And it was beautiful. But so that's the kind of story where you don't know the destination. There are also narratives where you do know the destination. And the point isn't the destination. The point of the narrative is the journey. Okay? Again, another technique that you'll see in plays, movies, and that kind of thing. The point is the journey. We just had an example of that a few weeks ago in the paper. Kim Murphy anchored a terrific profile of the Tsarnaev brothers, the Boston bombers. And she, with a cast of thousands, produced this portrait of those guys. And now we know how that turns out, right? But she told us all about their background and took us through their lives and their parents and their growing up and influences on them and everything. And the last two graphs of the story were this. On February 6th, 10 weeks before the Boston Marathon, Tamerlan walked into a Phantom fireworks store in Seabrook, New Hampshire. He had at least $400 and was not interested in firecrackers. Quote, "What is the most powerful item you have?" he asked. That's how the story ended. Right? So that's an example of where you know the destination and the point is the journey. And so that when you are trying to organize a story, when you're trying to structure something, you have to make these important decisions. Okay? It's not just a narrative. What kind of narrative is it? Now, going back to time elements, I want to share an example of how you can frame something in a very short period of time. Okay? A lovely little piece of writing from a few years ago by Paloma Esquivel. And I like this because it's a true narrative, and yet it only took about 20 minutes to unfold. Okay? And the other thing is, as far as narratives go, often we give away we often have that nut graph that kind of summarizes what everything's about, right? Or a summary lead. This is actually strict chronological order, okay? And yet it works. And then when it's all done, I'll see if you notice something. and the headline was, "His Final Homecoming." They stood on a small landing strip for private aircraft at Long Beach Airport. A mother and a father, a wife, family, and friends. They gathered for the arrival of the body of Army Sergeant David J. Hart, who was killed in combat in Iraq. There were no speeches, no eulogy. Those will come later. On Tuesday afternoon, there was only the quiet, methodical ceremony of a soldier's final homecoming. Framed by a clear blue sky, 8 members of a military honor guard stood at attention, waiting for a small charter airplane. The group's leaders walked down the line, adjusting hats to sit just so, wiping away the faintest smudge. To their right, police officers and sheriff's deputies stood, hands behind their backs, waiting to lead Hart's casket in a procession from the airport to a Boyle Heights crematory. Just before the aircraft made its final stop, 47 members of the veterans group Patriot Guard Riders filed out of a terminal waiting room and fanned out, forming a long line with fluttering American flags. Across the way, a group of airport workers in faded gray uniforms left their jobs when they saw what was happening and stood quietly observing, at attention in their own way. Even air traffic seemed to abate as everyone waited in silence. Hart of Lakeview Terrace died in Balad of wounds suffered in a firefight on January 8th, north of Baghdad. He was 22. Hart's family and friends waited just outside the terminal door. His mother, Sherry, stood with her arms wrapped around his widow, Nicole, quietly whispering words of consolation. They watched as the plane pulled up and its door opened. Army Specialist Richard Gilbert, who served with Hart in Iraq and who escorted his body home, walked out of the plane and stood at attention nearby. The honor guard's leader whispered instructions to the other members, who quietly made their way, marching in lockstep to the plane, when they lowered the flag-draped casket onto a stand. Arm in arm, Hart's widow and mother made their way up. They hesitated for a minute, and then Nicole draped herself over the wooden casket. Her mother-in-law held her. Soon they were joined by the rest of the family, Hart's father, Jack, brother Daniel, sister Sarah, and in his arms, Ruth and Ramiro Gonzalez and their son, Ramiro Jr. Each of them laid a hand on the casket, every once in a while whispering words to each other. They did not let go until the driver of the hearse gently said it was time to go. The honor guard, whose members had been waiting quietly at attention, made its way again to the casket and carried it to the hearse. The last soldier in line closed the door softly. She saluted and whispered the final instructions to her group before it marched away. The click-clack of dress shoes on the pavement was the only sound. And that's the story. Pretty damn cool, huh? That story, by the way, was all of 521 words. In the LA Times, about just 12 inches. So when it jumped, there wasn't much there. And I don't know how many of you noticed, there were no quotes. Did anyone catch that? No. Yeah, one no quote person? Okay, you got it. In fact, I mentioned this last year with the AJA. I worked for years with this terrific writer who was our previous Las Vegas bureau chief, Ashley Powers, who wrote this amazing column 1 that had to be about 60 some odd inches long, and it had no quotes. Just to see if she could do it, and it was fantastic. It was great. Anyway, notice that narrative, and it was a narrative, wasn't it? It was just from here to over here. And that's as far as we went, you know. So, and there were no car chases, you know, no people racing up and down, stairs or anything like that. So sometimes, you know, subtle things can really be revealing. And that's an example of them. And notice how we just structured that. We said, let's just do this one scene. So when you're struggling and you're saying, gosh, how do I write this thing? How do I write this thing? You know, well, maybe just tell it as it happened. Doesn't work all the time, but sometimes it can work really, really well. Okay, now, change of game here. Let's talk about something all writers just love. We're going to talk about anecdotes. It's anecdote time, okay? Because writers love these things. One classic thing that happens with structure, or one structural problem, maybe I should say, is stories that open with the wrong anecdote. Okay, you see this all the time as editors. And the thing that's tricky about this is the anecdote itself is usually pretty good, because if they put it up at the top, it is probably pretty funny, or dramatic, or violent, or sexy, or something, you know, most, right? The problem sometimes is it doesn't really reflect what the story's about. Oh yeah, what the story's about. the idea. He said the point. Yes, oh, that's right. Okay, and I saw this actually with Ashley, the one who wrote the wonderful column 1 with no quotes. She did this story about a sheep herders convention. I know, you're dying to go. And she did this story about this sheep herders convention, and they get together and they just tell stories. They swap stories. And here's the funny thing about the sheep herders convention: there were no sheep present. So we didn't even have any art of this because it's just people sitting around at like a Motel 6 talking. But they told stories. So she heard this story, this fairly dramatic story, and she basically had this opening that captured the story, and it was about how Lois Anderson, was in this desolate part of Utah, and it was snowing, and they had to rescue the sheep, and she had already hung the diapers out to dry, and then they froze, and and it went on, and it was very well written, and really compelling, and totally inappropriate. The reason was, it took us back in time, and this story is about the convention. Okay, so I said, it's a great anecdote. Don't kill it, just put it somewhere else. Let's find an anecdote that actually reflects the body of what this story is about. So this is what she wrote instead. Dateline, Nevada, Baker, Nevada. Once a year, let me lift this up. Once a year, the sheepmen, I love that word, the sheepmen, isn't that great? Once a year, the sheepmen, white-haired, crinkly-eyed, and some using walkers, almost like the sheep, except for the walkers, if you think about it. Anyway, they pack into a cafe to share stories of herding bull-headed sheep amid furious snowstorms here in Nevada's Snake Valley, a forlorn patch of desert on the border with Utah. In the mythology of the American West, the sheep herder may be outshunned by gunslingers and prospectors, but not when the sheepmen get together. Not tonight. Gusts rattle the walls of the border inn, much as they once pounded their desolate sheep camps, trailers so thinly insulated that men sometimes awoke to a cupboard full of frozen eggs. The open mic program is the highlight of the annual Old Sheep Herders Party. Okay? Herds have shrunk dramatically in recent decades, with more young people turning away from the business of their great-great-grandfathers. Quote, "There are no young sheep herders," said Dennis Coyle, the Border Inn's owner, who started this event about 9 years ago. Later, Coyle shared a tribute she felt would resonate with the folks who propped up her pit stop during the winter doldrums. Lee Jarvis recalled an odd night of twists after a ram sale. And Lois Anderson, well, she stole the show. Her story was about horse manure and frozen diapers. Okay, so that's the open. Now, notice what we did here is we made a reference to this diaper thing, right? Because we cannot resist frozen diapers. I certainly can. But be aware when you're selecting an anecdote for an anecdotal lead. Does this don't ask yourself just, is it cool? Because that's usually the bar we have. Oh, it's really cool, let's use it, okay. But does it really reflect what the story's about? Okay? And if it doesn't, find another anecdote, or use declarative opening, do something. Now, but, doesn't mean you necessarily should kill that anecdote. If it was that jazzy and fun, it's probably worth using. Just put it somewhere else, okay? And you'd be surprised how often that great anecdote becomes a good kicker. Seriously, try that now and then. Now, another point on anecdotes, and I think this is appropriate since we are in Hollywood here, and all that. I want to share with people who saw me last year know this one, but for other folks, I want to share with you the best tip I ever got on writing an anecdote. Okay, and it came from a guy who was a scriptwriter for Law and Order. And we invited him to come by on the theory that we're all dramatists of profession, storytellers. And so let's hear from a guy who does it. So he writes for Law and Order. And one writer asked him this. He said, your program, Law and Order, moves really fast. It's really fast-paced. How do you do that? And he said, oh, it's very simple. It's very simple. And I got to remember, Law and Order is the one that makes the funny sound, right? Whenever they cut to the scene, dong, the dong thing, right? Okay, dong. Okay, and he said, well, it's very simple. Dong. When we cut to a scene, I had to do that. When we cut to a scene, we don't cut to the beginning, we cut to the middle. Oh my God, my life changed at that moment. He said, I've had editors say, speed it up, make it faster to get to the point, but no one had ever told me how. This man told me how. He said, when we cut to a scene, we don't cut to the beginning, we cut to the middle. So in other words, if in one scene you have the cops talking and they say, yeah, we need to go talk to witnesses. Yeah, let's go get some witnesses right now. Dong, they make the sound. When they cut to the next scene, you don't hear the cops say, what happened? they cut to the witness who says, it was terrible. He started shooting and he killed everybody. Notice what I mean by start from the middle of the scene. So we went straight to the answer and we just did away with the question. Trust me, guys, this will save thousands and thousands of words for you as writers. Okay? And what I find really great as an editor for this, with using this technique, is it prevents me from killing anecdotes. Because usually that's the easy thing to do as an editor. If it's too long, just take it out, right? But you can usually take an anecdote and make it half its length if you use this technique. So it's a real good one to use. Start in the middle of the scene, as long as we're talking anecdotes. And then the other anecdotal technique that not everyone uses is to split the anecdote. Start in the middle of the scene. I wonder how many of you have dared to do that. And here's how it works. You start your anecdote, okay, and then at a dramatic point, go to the nut graph. You know, that part that tells us, so what's this story all about? And then you go back to the anecdote. Now, what's great about this technique is sometimes you have anecdotes that you cannot shorten. They're as tight as they can be. They're excellent. They're great. You cannot make them any shorter. But they're 8 inches long. And that ain't going to work for a newspaper story, right? So how do you deal with it? I'm going to give you an example. This one also, oddly enough, involves sheep. I tend to edit lots of stories about sheep, actually. Steve Padilla, ovine editor of the Los Angeles Times. Anyway, so this was a Santa Fe, New Mexico Dateline by Kate Linthicum. And here we go. Here's our little wild ride on the Woolly. It's 30 seconds before his big rodeo ride. And Julian Apodaca looks like he wants to disappear under the wide brim of his white cowboy hat. He's staring down at his boots, tugging at his lower lip, rubbing at his teary eyes. Julian's father, a former junior bull riding champion, has a hand on each of his 5-year-old son's shoulders. It's okay, hijo, Vince Apodaca says, as somebody plucks the hat off the boy's head and replaces it with a helmet. Cowboy up, okay, mijo? I don't want no crying when you get out there. This is the world of a little-known but beloved rodeo event where kids a couple of years out of diapers ride sheep, just like the big boys ride bulls. Suburban parents put their kids in Little League. In the country where rodeo is king, parents sign up their kids for mutton busting. In a flash, a rodeo hand lifts Julian out of his father's arms and swings him onto the back of an unhappy sheep, which is jerking around in a small pen. I love you, Vince calls out as the gate comes up. The sheep shoots into the arena, and there's Julian, clinging tightly to its neck. Suddenly the animal cuts right, and Julian slips left, tumbling into the dirt. As if that wasn't bad enough, the sheep kicks him with a hind hoof as it stumbles away. There are gasps all around. Then Julian stands up, wobbles a bit, and grins. Isn't that great of him? But notice what happened. The original anecdote was all one big chunk. And that nut graph, the one that went, this is the world of a little-known but beloved rodeo event. That appeared at the end of that long anecdote. And we thought that's just too long. So we put it in the middle. Try that, guys. You'd be surprised how well that can work. It doesn't work for everything, but it can. All right. Now, I think I quoted something from Lost in Space earlier. You know, danger, Will Robinson, danger. Okay. Let's share warning signs that your construction might be bad. Okay? I usually try to be more positive about these things, but I think these are warning signs that something might be screwy. Okay. Too many flashbacks. Be careful about that. You know, chronological order is a gift from God. And if you mess with that too much, you are violating the natural order. Now, not to say that flashbacks can't work now and then. And in fact, I've seen entire stories structured on this gimmick of, you know, present, past, you know, back and forth, back and forth. But it's often, you say, I hate it. It's very hard to follow, isn't it? It's very hard to follow. So use that sparingly. I think maybe one flashback enough per story is fine, but if you're going to do a lot of it, be afraid. Be very, very afraid. Be careful. In fact, have any of you read this astounding book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? Did any of you? One person way back there. Oh gosh. Oh, you're grinning. Oh my God. That book, by the way, which is incredible, is an organizational tour de force, because it tells two stories. It tells the stories of, believe it or not, about this woman who died in the 1950s, and doctors took some of her cells and were able to get them to grow in the lab. And those things are still growing to this day, and a gazillion pharmacological and medical advances have been achieved because of her cells, Henrietta's cells. And the book, when you look at it, you're kind of stunned, because there's one scene in 1950, and there's another one in 1990, and then 1953, and then 1996, and then 54, and then 2012, and you're going like, whoa, and you think it's confusing, and yet you understand what's happening totally. And I thought, what is going on here? In fact, Ashley Powers, the one who wrote the first sheep story, she gave me the book. She said, you gotta look what she's doing with structure. And what she did was, she told two stories. She told the story of Henrietta and her cells, which started in the 1950s and came to the present. And then the author, who became very intimately involved with the family of Henrietta Lacks, told her own story. So what she did was, she told both of them in chronological order. So whenever she left Henrietta and talked about herself, we were like, okay, but when we went back to Henrietta, we picked up where we left off. Is that making sense? So in other words, even though it technically jumped around, it really didn't. I really recommend it. It's just absolutely brilliant. I don't know how she figured this out, okay? But it's brilliant storytelling because she jumps around in time through the decades, and yet, in some respects, she's not jumping at all, and it has a definite logic to it. It's just astounding. But you, be wary of flashbacks, okay? Too many, oh, here's another warning sign. If your story has too many graphs beginning with but, still, or meanwhile, that might indicate you've painted yourself into a corner. Particularly if those appear in 3 consecutive sentences. Too many characters. That's another danger sign. You know, I don't know about you, I'm a simple person. You know, I can only absorb so much. So be careful about having too many characters. And I'll give you an example of that in a bit. Here's another one, warning sign. And all of you are guilty of this. All of you are guilty of this. All the real hardcore reporters. Where you use material mainly because it was so hard to get. Right? You've all done it. You've all done it. This guy I coached once, he'd sent me the story to read. It was really well done. And he was doing the things I had recommended. He had great verbs, and his sentences were ending with gusto, and it flowed, and it was great. But there was this one part that it just felt shoehorned in there. And I was convinced an editor had told him to do that. Because, you know, we have that gift of messing things up like that, you know. And I said, you know, man, I would either cut that or make a sidebar, or if there's no room for a sidebar in the paper, make it a web-only sidebar. You wouldn't believe how many, like, you know, leftovers we're putting on the web at the LA Times, by the way. Anyway, and his response, Jarrett is his name, and Jarrett said, but you know how hard it took to get that thing? And, you know, there's a good motivation for informing the reader, yes. So anyway, be careful about that. We confuse, if something is important, it's because of what it means. Again, it always comes back to that issue, not because of how much effort you put into getting it. I'm sorry, but we love you for your effort. We really do. Okay, so those are the warning signs that things are going screwy. Some advice on how to achieve flow and continuity. This one comes from Sesame Street. I already cited Law and Order. Sesame Street is keep like things together. Keep like things together, as simple as that. You know, and if you read a story in our paper, or the New Yorker, or New York Times, wherever, and it flows, and it just flows, you know, beautifully. Here's a little thing you can try. Look at the end of one paragraph and look at the beginning of the next, and you'll see that they tend to relate. Simple as that. Simple as that. So if you have a sentence that ends on the concept of hot dog, that next graph should probably be about mustard or bun or, you know, relish, you know, I don't know. But don't go to broccoli. That's just going to screw people up, okay? I mean, a bit facetious, but seriously, keep like things together. It's a way to achieve flow. Now, let me give you some tricks you can use to help organize your stuff. Okay? Label your story. I'm not talking about writing a headline, because that involves grammar and that will just mess you up. Okay? I don't want to talk about words, I want to talk about ideas, because that's the most important thing here. Give your story a label. Reunion. Redemption. I don't know, recovery. Some basic concept, okay? And you put that on a Post-it note and put it on your computer. I knew someone who wrote a 4-part series that was thousands of words, and she and her editor could not tell me what the topic was. Honest to God. And we spent a long time discussing that rascal. And then finally the editor said, well, you know, this whole thing is about transformation. And when he said that, the stars came out. It was beautiful. It was a romantic moment. Transformation. And I said, okay, unless it deals with the word transformation, you cannot use that quote, that anecdote, that whatever. That's the guiding principle. Okay? We had a terrific story along these lines a few years ago in the LA Times about a topic we all have seen here in Southern California. We had a column 1 about, of all things, the Rose Parade princesses. And generally we just run the feature shot, right? And the one that looks like this. That's about all we do. So these two reporters, Cara Miendamasa and Stephanie Chavez, followed the princesses around for weeks. And did you know it's like a full-time job? I mean, they do like literally dozens and dozens, if not scores of personal appearances. They get a whole wardrobe. There are, 7 of them, I guess? And we had all this great stuff, and we had absolutely no story. And but we did have a very good lunch to discuss this. And we were really torn because we thought, what do we do? We're going to do like 7 mini profiles? How boring would that be? You know? And other than just saying the Rose Parade princesses do a lot of stuff, what's the story? And Stephanie, bless her heart, she said, well, you know, that tournament is just a princess making machine. Princess making machine. There's the story. Because it was a My Fair Lady story. It was a Pygmalion story. It was, these young girls being turned into young ladies. And it wasn't just the transformation of the girls. That's somewhat focused, but even more focused was how the tournament does it. Because they kind of have this whole set routine on how to achieve that. So once she said princess making machine, it's like, oh, there we go. Okay, ran column 1, it was terrific. If you have a story that is a mixed salad, however, let's say you're writing about a disaster, okay, or a city council meeting where just a lot of stuff happens, and there is no one unifying theme, I think it's okay to have a mixed salad. Just tell the reader it's a mixed salad. You say, in a wide-ranging press conference that covered a whole lot of topics, comma, he said this, that, and the other thing. And then you can switch gears and everyone's fine with it, okay? Or you can say, in a council meeting that did a whole lot of stuff. My basic point being is, if you're gonna have a mixed salad, it's not a problem, just tell the reader it's a mixed salad. Otherwise, they'll think you're not focused, okay? Another good focusing device for writers. Think of your ending early on in the writing process. And it doesn't have to be the exact words necessarily, but at least the idea. If you're writing about a drug addict who's trying to recover, is it going to end, positive? Hey, I'm going to beat this thing. Is it going to be negative? Oh, he's doomed. Or is it going to be unresolved? And we don't know. You decide. I really don't care. It's up to you. I'm not here to judge. But the point is, think of the ending early on. It's like having that North Star to navigate to. I drive writers crazy, and there's a fair number here from the LA Times, and I think I've driven most of you crazy with this question, right? Because you'll show me the opening, because they're so eager. Here's my opening, and I declare it brilliant, of course. And then I'll say, and so how does your story end? It's like, oh, Steve, I spent all this time on the opening. Yes, I know. So seriously, if you think about the ending, at least in general ideas, early on, that will help you achieve better unity, better focus, and as a result, better structure. So try that. I rely more and more on visual aids. I don't know if this is a function of age or what. I believe in circling dates. This has happened where I've read a story and something doesn't seem to be jiving, but I can't tell why. Okay, and I read it in the computer, I read it in the printout, and I still can't figure out what's going on. I need help. I don't know about you, but I need help. So what I'll do is sometimes, if I notice there's a lot of dates, I just circle them, I just highlight them. And then I look to see if there are patterns. And often there are. I did this story about the housing crash in Las Vegas. And it was actually an organizational tour de force because it profiled 4 people at once going through time. Something you generally wouldn't do, but it worked. But it was kind of messed up at one point. And so I circled the dates and realized one problem was we were out of sequence. I also discovered that one date, bless you, that one date got circled more than any other, that 2006 appeared in many different places. But we violated the Sesame Street rule. We didn't put the 2006 stuff all together. And the importance here was that 2006 was when things really started to go to hell in a handbasket in Vegas. And in that year, one of our 4 protagonists lost her job. The other 3 had not lost their jobs yet. But they were doing things like putting in a new bathroom, buying a new car, buying a new ring. They didn't know that the ground is starting to crumble underneath them. So that added extra tension to it. And you did not feel that in the first draft because 2006 was spread all over the place. So by circling the dates, I was able to see that that we were missing the pattern. And we relied very heavily on chronological order, and particularly hammered, in a nice way I mean, the concept of 2006, which really enhanced things. So that's a good device. Another one along those lines is color coding. I've not done this often, but when I've had a very complicated story, I've color coded it. A young man I coached in Baltimore sent me a story to read about a gang retaliation killing. Lots of characters, lots and lots of characters. I ran out of colors, okay? So I resorted to, some had squiggly lines into them, some had double lines, some were circled, some were in boxes, you know, and I think I had 4 colors and I still ran out, okay. So I spread out all the sheets and I realized certain things. I realized that the story was allegedly about these 2 guys, and yet one of them barely appeared in the story, okay? And then the other thing was, this one guy, I forget if he was a squiggly line or a circle or what, but anyway, he appeared an awful lot. And I thought, God, maybe the story is completely, you know, screwy. Maybe we should be focusing on this guy, because he's in here so much. Well, the reason he was there so much was he witnessed this killing. And the cops interviewed him, and there was a transcript of the interview. Again, that issue of why am I using the material? I'm using it because I got it, right? So that information, that eyewitness to the killing was indeed pivotal, but he overtook the story. He overtook the story. So I talked to the reporter and said, okay, basically we need more squiggly lines over here and less boxes over here. You know, I mean, you could really visualize the story by having these reminders. You may not have to do it with every story, but it can be a useful device. If you're worried about being fair, put Smith in blue and Jones in red and count the blues and the reds. See how you're divvying them up. Okay, it's a good device. I'm also becoming increasingly a fan of note cards. I read that Kevin Pang, who's a terrific writer, the one that said those nice things about me. My God, Kevin with Chicago Tribune sent me this book called Save the Cat. Have any of you read that? It's a book about screenwriting. You know, I'm the one person in LA who has no interest in being a screenwriter, but it's a very good book. And he talks about the concept of storyboarding and these very firm rules in screenwriting. It's fascinating to read. And I find increasingly that you know, what they do is they'll write things on little cards and they put them up and organize them. I'm finding that when I've got a difficult story, I just make little, you know, I make my notes and I put them there on the table, and it's like, okay, wait a minute, wait. Oh no, there we go. Okay, now it's working. You know, and then you can like rearrange them, and you can literally see the story. In fact, this talk tonight is an example of the perils of bad organization. But you already noticed that, I'm sure. Because this talk, I could not rely on narrative. I could not rely on a key character. I couldn't do the venue, although this is a lovely place. I actually did get to Steve Allen. I once saw Steve Allen live. God, he was funny. It was amazing. But anyway, this talk is just strictly about ideas. So it was a real bear to organize. And so I found that I just had these various ideas, and then I would just reorganize them. I think it's much easier than typing up an outline, you know, or even using the your copy paste to move things around. Try it. You'll see it. It might work for you. Note cards, outlines, visual aids. I know I have thrown an awful lot at you tonight. It's been a whole semester. We talked about this whole concept of different organizing principles of time. We can use time. We can use place, character, point of view. You know, who's telling the story? Whose eyes are we using it to see? Theme. And we talked about visual aids, right? You know. And of course, our little trip down anecdote lane about starting in the middle of the scene and picking the right anecdote to open, you know. So I know that's a lot, But I want to encourage you guys to try to write with confidence. Because when you don't, I can tell. Seriously, and I don't know how I can tell, but I can. And a buddy of mine at the paper asked me to read a column he wrote. He's a reporter, normally doesn't do columns. And he said, I'm not too sure about this. And he sent it to me. And I read it, and I could tell. I can't tell you how I know. And I think I would have figured that out even if he hadn't, you know, given it away. It just wasn't his normal voice. And I think that the key here is fundamentally for journalists, solid reporting. If you don't know what you want to say, it's probably because you don't have enough material. Okay. Conversely, sometimes you have too much material. That's the issue. Isn't that, again, everything I've been saying tonight, there's the exact opposite that's true. sometimes you don't have enough material, and therefore you cannot write with confidence. Sometimes you have too much and you're overwhelmed, kind of like John McPhee, lying on the table, right? And so I find that you've got to just be committed to it. You've got to be committed. I was reminded of this, believe it or not, a few months ago, of all places, at a theater in Santa Monica, watching an astounding production of Hamlet. They only had 7 actors on the stage. One young man, this blonde guy, played Hamlet, and the other 6 did all the other characters. The Grave Digger, Polonius, Ophelia, everything, right? The Ghost. And they had slight costume changes, slightly changed their voices, but you could always tell, oh, that guy, yeah, he was the Ghost, he's Claudius, I can tell, But you went with it. You went with it anyway. And the stage was about as elaborate as this. Okay? This is maybe more elaborate than what they had. Okay? And yet you went with it because they did it with such conviction that it's like, okay, you're going to be Claudius? I'm with you. I'm with you. Okay, I'm here. Say your prayer. Okay. And so if you are committed to your material, okay, the reader will feel that. And if you are committed to your material and really have that sense of what you want to say, you will find the way to say it, and you'll find that elusive structure. And don't be embarrassed about using standard structures, about always starting with an anecdote, a nut graph, and then using chronological order. Yes, it's a tried and true form, but that's okay. That's okay, okay? That's all right. I'll give you a musical analogy. Mozart is not credited with creating opera. He did not create the symphony. He did not invent the string quartet or the sonata. Okay? He did not invent any musical form. But he wrote operas, sonatas, concertos, like nobody else. He used established forms, but just made great works with them. So all I'm asking you to do is be like Mozart. Is that too much to ask? And my hope is that that when you go on to write stories, that you'll be able to use some of these devices to give it a sense of unity. Keep it on that one idea. Okay, write about, and you can have little tangents. You can have little extra bits of material. If you're writing about the Mississippi River, you can mention the Missouri. But don't start writing about the Amazon, okay? Just stick with the Missouri, just stick with the Mississippi and do the tributaries, but don't go to the Nile, okay? Stay with me here. So I hope you write something that is structured and flows and maybe has sheep in it even, and then in the end, someone will come up to you and they'll say, "Hey, I read your story. Loved your structure," and that's the final thought of the night. Thank you.